Okay. Thank you all again for watching that with us. And what we'll do now, we'll proceed with the panel. I'll introduce the panel, ask a few questions to the panelists, and then open up the floor for a good conversation, questions, comments from you all as well. So first to introduce, Simona Foltine is a journalist and documentary filmmaker currently based in Baghdad. Her work focuses on in-depth coverage of armed struggle, social justice, corruption, and human rights. And as you know, this was the documentary that she was the filmmaker for. Rothna Begum is a senior women's rights researcher at Human Rights Watch, focusing on discrimination and violence against women and girls in the Middle East and North Africa region. And Janat Al-Ghazi is a women's rights activist and works with the Organization of Women's Freedom in Iraq to support women throughout Iraq escape by offering them shelter, skills training, protection, and legal services. And sadly, she is unable to join us today and will be joining us from Baghdad via Zoom for the conversation. So it's really good to see such a big crowd coming out for this. Clearly, the topic is very important. Oftentimes, especially at Chatham House, we tend to talk about security, politics. It's not like there's nothing going on in Iraq today or in the last few days, but really, these are some of the key issues in the core of what we are talking about. And so it's really good to focus on something like this and to really go in depth into it. But also I think what we want to do with the panel is reflect on what this means as well for those of us working in different aspects of Iraq, the Middle East, or these issues. So my first question to Simona, which I think is a typical question asked at these screenings, is if you can maybe, since the time of making the documentary until now, if you have any updates, if you've been following what happened with the trafficker, with the women, or with the police and the judge that were characters on in your documentary.
Yeah, thanks, Renat. So the trafficker was convicted, as we saw, and he's still in prison. However, there is an appeals process. And what ends up happening a lot of times is that whoever is backing these traffickers, because as I mentioned in the documentary, he is really just a small fish. The big guys rarely get arrested and put behind bars. So what happens a lot of times during the appeals process is that's when the pressure happens on the judiciary. And a lot of times, the pimps or the madams end up getting released during the appeals process. As of right now, he's still behind bars. He was also convicted on a second charge for raping his own daughter, separate to trafficking. But yeah, time will tell whether he will actually serve his life sentence or not. As for the girls, the two girls who were in the government safe house, they're still there, Noor and Shahad. It's very difficult for them to see a future, and I think it's really heartbreaking because if you speak to them, they have the motivation to start over. They want to start a new life despite all the trauma that they went through. Shahad always kept saying, I want to become a lawyer because I want to help women who went through the same thing as I did. And Noor, she wants to raise her son as a single mother. But the truth is that there are a lot of obstacles in their way. First of all, to just be released from the safe house, they need to be handed to a male guardian, which often means they go back to the same abusive environment that pushed them down that path in the first place. And unfortunately, the government has no program whatsoever to help these women reintegrate. There is no real strategy in terms of education, vocational training to help them get back on track. So unfortunately, these are really deeply rooted structural issues that are very difficult for them to overcome.
And maybe if I can go to Janat now, joining us via Zoom. You featured prominently in this video because of the brave work that you've been doing. Simona has described many different types of officials, effectively many different types of men in different levels. You as someone who has been campaigning for women's rights, for some of these issues, where do you find the biggest impediments where do you find the biggest challenges? What are the challenges to someone like you who is on the front line trying to help many of these women who suffer across the country? No, because I think there's no audio.
تمام
Oh, okay.
مساء الخير. أنا بالنسبة لي كناشطة في منظمة حرية المرأة في العراق أعمل منذ 15 سنة على قضايا إنقاذ النساء في العراق. بالنسبة لي الشيء الأصعب اللي أشوفه إنه إحنا صار لنا 19 سنة نناضل نتعب لأجل جلب موارد لعملية إنقاذ النساء، بينما موارد العراق تروح لجهات، تروح لأشخاص ضد النساء، ويعملون أيضاً مو بس ضد النساء، يعملون بطرق تخلينا إحنا تحت المساءلة القانونية. بالنسبة إلي ولمنظمة حرية المرأة في العراق، العوائق القانونية اللي ما تقبل، اللي ما تسمح لنا بإنقاذ النساء هي الأكبر. البعض يسألون إنه شنو هاي العوائق القانونية؟ إحنا في العراق ما عندنا قانون يسمح بفتح دور الإيواء. فتح دور الإيواء فقط ضمن وزارة مولصة اللي هي وزارة العمل والشؤون الاجتماعية، ونحن أمام الدولة بقينا سنوات طويلة ملاحقين قانونياً، اجتماعياً، ميليشياتياً، عشائرياً في سبيل إنقاذ النساء. هذا أول عائق بالنسبة لي.
Thank you. Thank you for that. And maybe if we can pick up, Rothna, on some of the threads in your experience being an analyst of these issues, you see obviously in decision makers across all being men, but especially in the judiciary, you know, in the mechanism of accountability, those who are making laws, those who are enforcing laws, as we've seen in this, are also men, which means that women go through these processes without considerations. Can you just unpack a bit how the kind of patriarchal norms, but also the kind of hegemonic masculinity you see entrenched in these institutions really does make it even worse once they get into the positions of being at a trial?
Well, I just want to start by saying this documentary is a really good example of the entire process in which a girl, from the very beginning until this happens, has to experience a huge amount of discrimination and violence against her, right? And that's completely at the root cause is patriarchy. So the entire society is set up with its laws, as Janat was talking about, with its laws and its policies and its structures to treat girls and women as second-class citizens in their own country. And what we see is, for instance, men who are legislators, as you say, and as judges, are going out of their way to pass laws and to enforce laws that will discriminate against women. So we have laws that basically, in Iraq, that provide husbands with the right to discipline their wife and their children, which allows for mitigating sentences if you kill a woman for honorable motives, or if you come upon them in the act of illicit sex. So you come across your sister or your wife having illegal sex, and you kill them in that moment, that would be forgiven or reduced sentences. So you have, and then even more so, you also have situations in which somebody who's a rape survivor, if the rapist marries them, they can also be excused of conviction or prosecution as well. That part, by the way, is actually a French code provision from a colonial era relic. But these laws, which were inspired or kept on in the provisions, help to actually enable violence in the home and violence against women more broadly. It doesn't just exist. It exists because it's being encouraged. And then you have a situation where in Iraq, you don't have a law on domestic violence. Only the Kurdistan region of Iraq has that law. But the mainland Iraq has not passed a law, despite a lot of efforts by incredible women's rights activists in Iraq who've been pushing and pushing for years. It's just been stalled. And so in fact, the legislators will go out of their way to try and get it killed. So what happened was there was a draft domestic violence law, which, while it had some really good provisions, like for instance restraining orders, assistance, so something like what the girls were going through, you should have referral mechanisms. There should be able to be ways to identify them in that moment. There's a girl being subject to forced marriage. There should be a school that is alert and able to work out that she's subject to that abuse. You have a girl going to a mosque, trying to seek refuge. They should have been referring her to child support services. There are all these ways in which you can try and intervene at the very early stages to prevent it from happening in the first place. And a law on domestic violence would help to do that. But Iraq, we've got half the region in the Middle East and North Africa now have laws on domestic violence, but Iraq still refuses to do this. And this draft law would have tried to help change this a little bit.
And the shelters are part of that.
And the shelters are a key part of that, right? So there are a few government shelters which are highly problematic, and the few NGO shelters that do exist are really under threat. So we have women's rights activists talking about, we have tribal families that will come up and actually invade the shelters and bring women and girls out of there. So they're really at danger as well. So they do need a law that will say that they're allowed to establish them and allowed to get protection in those instances. So we have serious issues that a law would actually help. What we saw happen was in 2017, when a draft law was going through Parliament, there were male legislators who were trying to get it killed. So what they did was they proposed a law to make the personal status law, which is about family, marriage, and divorce, to make it worse. So you have a current personal status law, which is not great, but it's there, and they wanted to allow for religious communities to decide on their own, which would have allowed for some communities to have girls as young as 8 to be married off. So of course the women legislators were then trying to push that back, because that would have been incredibly bad and committed even more.
By the way, even have women legislators from the conservative parties, which
who were also supportive as well.
Exactly.
But the head of the women's committee in the parliament was the one who tried to basically got it killed. But we had women saying that one of the things that the male legislators said to them, there was obviously a handful of them who did this, was that they were doing this in part to kill the domestic violence bill. And it was. So what we saw was that bill got, the personal status one got pushed to the side, and the domestic violence one has just been suspended now for years. And in part of it is also these legislators who were pushing against the domestic violence bill were doing it for political reasons, populist reasons. They were trying to get elected again in May 2018, and it works to their advantage, to their male voters, to be seen to be misogynistic and have misogynistic policies. So, we see this in all sorts of countries, including the UK. Well, in Iraq is a similar kind of story as well.
So I guess my next question, and I'll ask the same question first to Simona and then to Janat. Rothna is talking about this legal approach perhaps as a potential way to begin working out of this. Can there be a law? Can the legislatures? In your opinion, Simona, what can be done? What are the steps to start beginning to address some of these issues? Because it seems like the task force and what they have right now isn't really offering enough of a solution.
I mean, it's a really difficult question, and I was thinking about it as I was making this documentary, because of course, I got to know these women over months of filming with them, and in the end, it's heartbreaking because you have them voicing their desire to start their life all over, and you just know it's just not going to happen, because the dominance of the patriarchy is just so strong that it's hard to know where to even begin to change the societal structures that that drive women down this path, but also prevent them from reintegrating into society. And I think it needs to be ultimately tackled at the very heart of the problem. You need to go to the tribal sheikhs, you need to go to the clerics, because they are the gatekeepers. They are the ones who protect this hegemonic masculinity, as you said. And that's an incredibly difficult conversation to have. If you do that as, let's say, a Western institution or an organization that is getting funded by a Western institution, immediately you're going to lose legitimacy. You're going to be accused of trying to spread Western, liberal values that are contributing to the, breakup of the Iraqi family and all of these things. So it needs to be something that happens internally within Iraqi society that is owned by, certain individuals who are part of that power structure but recognize these problems. And General Wissam is one of them. I mean, he still, to some extent, embodies some of these patriarchal norms, the way he speaks, to survivors, but his heart is in the right place, and he sees the problems, So you need people who are on the inside. You need like a tribal sheikh, a cleric who is relatively progressive, but who will be respected, who has
and
the...
are these people there, in your experience in Iraq?
So there are very few. But
So how do you bring them together? How do you connect them?
I have no idea, to be honest. And it's something that I think really needs to kind of happen from within. It's a conversation that needs to, I think first, there needs to be recognition that this problem exists. And even that is not the case. As I mentioned in the documentary, there is this perception that the women who end up in prostitution, they want to do it. So even the desire to even help them is not even there. So that is the first step, recognizing that these are victims in the end. A very easy thing to do would be to, for example, approach the Kademia shrine, because many of the survivors I interviewed were recruited very close to the shrine, because what ends up happening, these girls from these, rather conservative and usually poor backgrounds, when they're in distress, when they run away from home, where do they go? They go to the shrine because they believe that they will get protection, they believe that they will get help, and the traffickers know that. So they're literally placing themselves around the shrine and looking for these girls, for these women to pick them up. So the first step would be something like just take them off the street. Okay, let's think about the solution later, but just get them off the street so they don't end up in the hands of the traffickers. So it's these conservative institutions, that are really, the gatekeepers, the holders of the power. They are the ones where the solution lies, and it's extremely difficult of how to approach them, how to convince them that this is a problem that needs to be tackled. But I do believe that you need to work with these organizations and institutions to bring about change. If you come as an external actor, or even an organization like Jannat, which is doing incredible work, which is so important, it's very difficult for them to engage with these individuals because there will just not be a legitimacy.
And maybe if I can now ask the question to Jannat. We're having, this conversation about solutions, incremental or radical solutions, ideas. In your opinion, is it through parliament? Is it through social actors, tribes, clerics, a mix? Based on your experiences, is it in activism? How do you view a solution to this? What would you be telling policymakers if you were in this room today, or you are, and there might be policymakers here as well? What would you tell them in terms of how should we think about solutions?
أنا بالنسبة لي سمعت الكلام اللي قاله سيمونة، وأنا كلش أختلف وياها فيما يتعلق بإشراك رجال الدين والعشائر. لأن رجال الدين والعشائر هم اللي يسمحون بزواج الصغيرات، هم اللي يغتصبون الصغيرة باسم الدين. الفتاة لما تتوجه للأضرحة والمقامات، لأن هو هذا المكان الوحيد اللي تعرفه، بس بالأروقة اللي تروح الأماكن الأضرحة أكو سماسرة متخصصين يرتدون العمائم، يعرضون على الفتاة زواج متعة، زواج منقطع، وزواج سيد. فالرجل الدين اللي يسمح بزواج صغيرة هذا ما يقدر ينتشل وحدة من البغاء. هذا أول نقطة بالنسبة لي. أتركك الترجمة وأرجع للنقطة الثانية لو أستمر.
تفضلي.
زين. القضية الثانية اللي تخص الحلول اللي إحنا نتوقعها كمنظمة نسوية تحررية في العراق هو عبر القوانين. إحنا بدينا بعدة دعوة أولى قدمناها للمحكمة الاتحادية بالطعن بالقوانين الدستورية اللي خليها بالقانون وتقول هاي القوانين تخص النساء، منها قانون غسل العار اللي هي المادة 409 والمادة 128 الخاصة بالباعث الشريف، المواد اللي تسمح بزواج القاصرات. فبالنسبة إن إحنا دا نطعن عبر المحاكم المختصة بعدم شرعية وجائزية هذه القوانين. من ناحية ثانية أنا أشوف إنه يتم تمكين المنظمات النسوية اللي عندها تاريخها، اللي عندها سمعتها، واللي عندها عملها الطويل لإنقاذ هاي الفتيات، واللي ساعدوا. يعني إحنا بالنسبة لنا كمنظمة حرية المرأة.
To our organization as a women's freedom organization, along the course of our organization work, we have witnessed the death of 1,200 women during that, while other organizations who receives millions in support from different governments such as the EU, the UK, resources go. So sorry, she said we saved 1,200 women with very limited amounts of resources, while other organizations used to receive a huge amount of support for saving barely dozens of women. So when it comes to us as an organization, we believe that the only way forward is through enabling and supporting women organizations and supporting laws and legislations which put us on equal foot as a human being and celebrate the rights of women to live and to live. The only way is through legislations and laws. However, addressing this through clerics and tribal leaders, we have tried this over decades. Would you expect a cleric to give women and serve them justice and give them their rights? I think it would be a waste of time to waste another 2 decades in order to convince a cleric to accept women rights, but rather we should pursue a top-down approach, similarly like what has been applied towards the Vatican, when the clerics have been requested to save and spare the civil laws and civil rights from their interventions and not to decide the fate of humans. This is quite a shame in the 21st century.
If we can pick up on the role of international actors, you know, Janat was talking about almost 20 years of democratizing Iraq and some of the challenges at addressing some of these really big problems, social problems that will affect any attempt to build a state. How do you see, Rothna, the challenges? Where is the money going? You know, we're talking about hundreds of millions being spent. Where has it gone? What are the challenges? What can be done for the international actors to do better in reaching some of these problems?
Well, I think some of it is the way they present these issues to Iraqi authorities themselves, right? So we have laws on the books in Iraq that were inspired by the British and the French. So you could easily have UK officials going, look, we did bad. We had these laws and we agree that these are problematic laws in your books too. So there's an approach in which they could be doing this. There's also the question about what is that money being spent. So if you're training the police, how much are you doing gender responsive training? When you're training judges, how much are you doing that? There are some very small, specific things that could be done tomorrow if they wanted to do it. I mean, I know we're talking about the big things like if they don't understand it to be a big problem, then they're not going to address it as a solution. So domestic violence, some of the big issues that we're talking about, that is the bigger, much bigger issue. But there are lots of small things that could be fixed. They have an anti-trafficking law that is problematic in itself, right? They need to change that. That could be changed because there's willingness there, because they have a trafficking law anyway. You have an issue of virginity testing as part of working out whether somebody was raped. We were able to get that fixed in Dohuk for a very short time, where after Yazidi women and girls faced a systematic sexual slavery, and we had raised the issue of the fact that in trying to document rape against these women and girls, the officials were encouraging them to go through virginity testing as a form of rape documentation. And we went to them and said, that's not how you do this. This is actually traumatizing for them. Here's how you do it. And then they changed it, but they had to get the judge in Dohuk to basically agree, and the health services to also agree that this was the form that they were going to use. So that could easily be done on a mainland Iraq level as well. So there are small things that could be done at an intervention level, all these kind of bits and pieces. You have one of the key issues you saw was the way in which they end up charging women for prostitution instead of treating them as trafficking survivors, and the way they're sort of dealing with that. We had a very similar case in Lebanon where you had the same kind of issue where the Lebanese authorities were very keen on dealing with sex trafficking, and yet they were not prosecuting sex trafficking. And it was all kind of like very well intentioned and yet complete failure. And that was because when it was getting to the judges, they were essentially committing the traffickers to facilitating prostitution. And in doing that, they started to convict the women to prostitution, even though the women were involved in the raid and brought the whole case to the court. The authorities did that instead. And so it was kind of like looking it up and basically saying this is where the failures are and you need to rectify this. So for the international community, they can look at those specific things. They can help to address those. They can help to back women's rights organizations. There's been a serious funding cut, I think, in terms of women's rights organizations getting that funding. For them to do both the work of like protections and shelters for women where they're able to do so, but also for that awareness raising, because that's what really needs to happen at every single level of society to be able to move the issue forward. And I just want to say, when we talk about domestic violence, I mean, Saudi Arabia has a law from 2013, okay? And this is a country which had the most systemic male guardianship system in the region. But they understood that domestic violence was a serious problem. And it had come to the point where they just recognized that this was a problem and that something had to be done. It wasn't done the best way, but they did try to, right? And it's that same point. You need to get the society to an issue to say, look, this is a problem. We all have to agree to this problem first. Before then, we can go through the series of solutions and how we're going to get that changed.
Yeah, that's very interesting, that it's not just about looking at, spending money needs to be spent on gender groups and support, but also in everything else. In all the state building, in the politics, in the security, economy, these considerations have largely been absent, and probably why they haven't been as successful. I don't know if there are questions. We can open up the floor now. I have lots more questions. I can keep asking questions. I love doing that, but if there are other people who want...
بس أنا عندي مداخلة وحدة.
أي تفضلي.
In Iraq, there is a trafficking, anti-trafficking law, which is 28, 2012. There is anti-trafficking, which criminalizes trafficking in Iraq. However, what happens in Iraq, in reality, that it is not enabled, and it goes in conflict with the civil status, personal status law. The trafficking law says that women who are subject to trafficking would be treated as victims, and they should be referred to special safe houses to help them to restart their lives again. However, the personal status law, which addresses the civil law affairs, convicts those who engage in prostitution up to 15 years of convictions. There is a law, but it is not enabled. So we need to put it into practice, the trafficking law, and to train and equip the cadres and the personnel of these institutions, because they don't have any backgrounds whatsoever. And by the way, they don't embrace this culture. And any woman who is brought to them would be stigmatized and abused and mistreated at the different police stations. I just wanted to highlight this aspect.
It's a very important point. In the other areas we look at, Iraqis are very good at creating laws and committees and legal bodies to make it look like something will happen. But of course, as Janat's saying, that's only one step. The enforcement and ensuring that these laws are respected is another. So thanks for that. We have some questions around. We can start taking them. Yeah, over there, and then. Just one, okay, yeah. There's going to be a mic above your head. So.
Cheers, thank you. One of them was the documentary focused on Baghdad and Erbil, and just wondering whether the issue is particularly focused there, and if the victims are generally from like bigger cities, or if it's actually an issue in rural regions as well. And then the other question was just about, you mentioned kind of armed groups supporting this, and whether that's individuals or whether there's a kind of more organized, like particular armed factions or groups that are known to be supporting it.
Ooh, getting into the dangerous details of this.
I cannot speak generally because, it's extremely difficult to even speak to trafficking survivors. I interviewed 6 for this documentary, 3 of whom were included in the end. All of them were from, a rather poor socioeconomic background, but both from rural and urban areas. But so in general, what I found among this very small sample of women is that the women who grow up in very conservative settings, who don't have education, who don't have financial independence. They are the ones who are more susceptible to being exploited so first of all, being exposed to domestic violence or child marriage, and then being lured into prostitution and exploited by traffickers. The question about armed groups, I don't think it's necessarily systematic, but to be honest, I'm not too sure. I don't think it's one specific group. I think it's many of them. I did leave out the names of 2 specific armed groups which were mentioned by victims because I just didn't think that it was helpful to focus on them because there are others who do it as well. And secondly, it would just be dangerous for everybody involved to name specific groups. There is no doubt that, as Janat and I, when we were driving through Batawin, this red light district in Baghdad, there is no doubt that the armed groups, the militias, take money from these establishments for them to operate, be it restaurants, be it brothels, be it nightclubs, alcohol stores. They have basically carved up this area and they take money from them. That's not something that is specific to prostitution. That's just the way Iraq's economy functions. Any sector, whoever wants to do business in Iraq has to pay somebody off. But whether there is, a specific person or a specific group that is controlling the prostitution networks, I don't know the answer. Maybe Janat would know, although I know she's also trying to not get into too many of those details for her own safety.
Remind that this is a public.
Exactly.
This will be on YouTube,
we have to keep that in mind. But from what I have heard from the victims is that it's definitely they come as customers, both the armed groups, the police, and it's, they will have a certain general, a certain commander, backing a certain pimp or a madame, and that's how they kind of get the protection. I'm not sure whether it's at an organizational level where officially, okay, we're backing this, but I mean, definitely it's, they're heavily involved, whether it's systematic or individual, I cannot say with certainty, yeah.
Maybe we can take a few questions because there's lots of hands. Yeah, there's one here and then one there and one here. Lots of questions. All right, we'll take if you can.
There is an Iraqi law, as she said, and that is number 28 of 2012, Article 14, and we need to update it and upgrade, and we need to make it more effective. The other issues, which is we have been discussing so far, all how to cure or how to enforce the law in Iraq. But we haven't discussed, or the biggest issues, to go to the roots. What caused those little girls to do this? What's society? The poverty, it's one of the causes. The environmental impact is one of the causes, the way they lived. So we need to go deeper with those families. My question is, what can other NGOs, not necessarily the NGOs who are working with women. So I am an environmentalist, and I am the president of the Iraqi Environment and Health Society UK, and also we work with renewable energy and climate change. Okay, so how can I, as a society, help and as a civil society, help and support and give effort to end this terrible crime against humanity? And do you think those crimes organized and protected by armed group and militias? Thank you.
Thank you. Can you just thank you for introducing yourself. You have reminded me that my role as the moderator is to ask everyone to introduce themselves. The armed groups question gets off scot-free without a name, but from now on, if people could introduce themselves. There's a question over there in the back. Oh, yeah. The hand. There's lots of hands. This is great. You can just go 1, 2, 3.
Yeah, thank you. I'm Dastan, the master student at SOAS, and I'm originally from Erbil. So basically, like in the Kurdistan region and also in Iraq, when there's a talk about the prostitution or the sex work, there is another group which, like, their name comes a lot, who are the girls who are brought from the neighbor countries. So like during your research and investigation, do you know like what happens to them? Like, because you know they are not the Iraqi citizen, and like how they receive the help if they seek to the legal, like what's the protection for them? So like, and also there's another group, maybe like during the last 10 years, like we are hearing some stories about the IDPs and refugees, like they are also like facing, like the girls and women in the camps facing the same issues. So like, what are the protection for them as well? Thank you.
Great. You can go to, yeah, and then we come to this.
Hey, my name's Louisa Lovelock. I work for the Washington Post. Simona, thank you for a great documentary. The child storyline, I think, is really interesting. Could you talk a bit about kind of what happens to these children? They said that they were sort of still, quote unquote, with the traffickers. What do they use them for? Are they incidentally with them? And what can be done for them?
Great. One more question. I am writing these down, so I will give a, just in the back. Yes.
I'd like to ask Jannat, what does she need for her work? What type of support internationally? From donors, from governments, what does she need for women's organization, women's freedom organization, in terms of symbolic or material support or any other type of support?
Thank you for that question. Those are a lot of questions. Maybe we can, each person can take 2 or 3 minutes to answer one or all, beginning with Jannat.
With the last question.
Yeah, with the last question on how can people, some of them in this room, help?
For us, the most important is, of course, we need material support. We need funds in order to be able to continue. I would like to clarify that in Baghdad, we have 5 safe houses. They can host up to 10 to 12 girls at a time. In our organization, we have 46 cases at the very now. We need logistic support in forms of enacting laws, reach to the decision-making circles and centers. Those influential persons in the government, we can't reach out to them unless we have support from influential international actors. It's quite important for us if we can be empowered to talk to the policymakers and decision makers in order to explain to them about our work and engage them with the cases we are addressing and tackling on daily basis. So we need logistic support, financial support in order for our projects to continue. There is a second point I would like to highlight to be addressed perhaps later on, which is foreign workforce. We tend to treat foreign labor forces, certainly from Africa. Most of them end in the prostitution industry, certainly girls from that part of the world.
If we can pick up on that, maybe to Rathna first, this issue of neighboring countries and others coming in. Have you looked into that research, and how does that take, a very state-centric version of Iraq and view it as a more regional, issue of trafficking of women across these borders that don't seem to be as strong?
Yeah, I mean, just to say, when it comes to trafficking of foreign women, you saw Iraqi women, when they are referred, they end up stuck in a state shelter or like a detention, essentially another form of prison, right? What happens with the foreign women is that they get deported. They get not just prostitution charges, but they get immigration violation charges. So the problem in Iraq is the immigration system itself, which is very similar to the Gulf, which makes it very difficult for anyone who's a foreign person to be able to leave environments. And in fact, I had a case 2 months ago of a woman who claimed that she was being held by an agency and forced and being beaten because she was supposed to be doing domestic work, and she'd left the family home where she was also facing abuse, and we were trying to get help to her to sort of get her out of that situation. But those cases, there's a lot more of those cases, and there are women going to Iraq where they have no idea the situation in this country, where they have no embassies, no one to turn to. So the situation is quite dire if you are foreign women in these countries. We see this time and again with women who are facing traffic situation or vulnerable situations where they are the most marginalized communities. So if you are a woman from a more poorer socio-economic background, if you're a foreign migrant woman, if you're an internally displaced person or a refugee, all of these women are more exposed to the risks of things like trafficking and other forms of abuse. So it's really important to deal with the structural issues that leave them marginalized, right? They're not born with this kind of, just because they're a Syrian refugee, it doesn't mean that you're born being vulnerable. You're made vulnerable by the structures of the system. So the state itself must deal with those structures, otherwise they will always remain exposed to those vulnerabilities. One thing I wanted to tackle was your question on poverty. This is a serious issue in Iraq, where we're talking about and linking to the armed groups. We've recently published a report on the LGBT community, individuals who have been facing severe violence from the state, from armed groups, and by their families. And armed groups in particular, the militarization, if you will, or the increase in people being recruited into armed groups is happening as a large result because of poverty in the country, where families are so destitute that boys are being recruited into armed groups. There's a toxic masculinity as part of that recruitment drive, and that's impacting specific individuals like people from LGBT backgrounds or women as well. So this kind of linkages between poverty, armed groups, and the toxic masculinity that leads to discrimination and violence against women must be addressed. And when it comes to poverty, one of the issues you could talk about with the international community is the sheer lack of what you would call social protections. Social protections are really important for any country, for any society, including in the UK, I would say, where you're driving people into poverty and forcing them into choices that they otherwise would not have been driven into. And unless you tackle that, the root cause, everything else is much more difficult to address going forward.
Simona?
So to your question about the root causes, I think it's important to go back in history a little bit and recognize that women's rights in Iraq were much better in the 1960s, for example, when Iraq was actually at the forefront of women's rights in the Middle East. And then, over the past 4 decades or so, we had this incredible reversal, which began with the Gulf War and the sanctions, where you had a sudden increase in poverty, education and women's employment went down, and also because of Saddam Hussein's faith campaign, where he tried to mobilize support from tribes and clerics, there was a rise in, let's say, religious institutions and the way they impacted society. So on top of that came then the American invasion in 2003, which just resulted in the complete destruction of rule of law institutions, the rise of armed groups. So to some extent, this is also, let's recognize, this is the legacy of the 2003 invasion that we have, because it's not just a gender issue, it's an institutional issue, the corruption, the lack of rule of law. All of these factors affect women as they affect everybody else in society. So, if you're talking about how to tackle this, I mean, it's the $1,000,000 question of how do we tackle these general issues that we're facing in Iraq today. I do think that education is one of the most important issues, and that just takes a really long-term view, a long-term strategy, commitment from the government to spend on education. If we look at the level of education in Iraq today, it is really in a very, very poor state. Like literacy rates, have gone down. If you look at other indicators like child marriage, it has increased since 2003. So I think if you invest in the human capital, the social sectors, I think you can slowly begin to tackle these causes. But if we think that it has taken 4 decades to get to this point where we have lost whatever was there before, it will take the same amount of time to rebuild, which is extremely depressing if you think about it. Louisa, to your question about the children, so of course, a lot of the trafficking victims and survivors will end up falling pregnant and having children. And so usually the traffickers, they will use those children to pressure them into work and to exploit them. And the children themselves then are often sold. So they can, for example, be sold to somebody else to exploit them for begging. So when you're driving through Baghdad or even Erbil and you see, for example, a woman begging with a child, there's a very good chance that's not her child. That's a trafficked child that was sold to her. And that's why it's extremely difficult, for example, for one of the survivors. Like Noor, it was very challenging to get her child back because there was this danger that the child is going to be sold on and then it will be impossible to recover him. Even after they're recovered, then there is the first problem is that they don't have any documentations because they were born out of wedlock. They don't have an ID, and without an ID, you cannot do anything. You cannot, go to school. You don't exist in the eyes of the state. And so that is the first challenge, getting that child an ID. And that is why a lot of the survivors, they think that marriage is their only chance because once they marry, then that new husband will become the father of a child and then they can get identifications documents. But of course, the question is, who are they going to marry? A lot of times it ends up being pimps, previous clients, and then the whole cycle begins all over again.
So we're going to go and ask 2 more questions and go a bit over. Okay, 3 more questions and go a bit over. And to anyone else who has questions.
بس عندي تعليق على سيمون.
تفضلي.
I have a comment. In Iraq, children without fathers don't have IDs. But if we tried to apply for ID cards for them, what would be mentioned in that ID is a code which would identify them as illegal children. So if the government issued an ID card for them, it would go forever, a permanent stigma. Anywhere they go, they would be identified as illegal birth. So there is possibility to issue these IDs. However, these IDs would sustain a permanent and eternal shame for those children. So those victims who have been forced into prostitution, when we used to convince them to get IDs for their children to enable them to join the educational institution, their moms would reject this. They would refuse because they would argue that the government would put that permanent stigma on their IDs. They would be always identified as illegitimate children. So this is the most challenging point which needs to be addressed in the future, to take this stigma out of the IDs of those children, to give them an opportunity to pursue a new future.
Moving forward, obviously they're the future. Okay, 3 very brief questions. And then we can all go to that popcorn, which I don't even know if we have popcorn or not, but there's something. Please, yeah. If you can introduce yourself, please. The microphone will come, yeah.
Hello. Yep, absolutely. Hi, I'm Daria, the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe, and my question is about the international dimension of human trafficking. In particular, I was wondering, to what extent do international trafficking networks play a role in enabling what is going on in Iraq? Thank you.
Right. Closer, please. Yeah, okay. Name is Mahbub al-Chalabi. I'm a Chatham House. Right. I'm a member of Chatham House, yeah. Got 2 points. The first one is the question of prostitution and trafficking, etc. Actually predates 2003. During the sanctions, the really very severe sanctions that it's typical that Iraq was losing 200 children were dying per day. As a result of those sanctions, many families of the sort of limited income and etc. actually forced their daughters to go into prostitution. And it's, I suppose, a point that would be directed to
Thank you.
Iraq itself. That's the first point. The second point is we go back in the 1950s, there was actually an official brothel in Baghdad, and I believe there was a smaller one in Basra. And they were both officially controlled so that the actual poor girls, the victims, were having to go through a weekly medical test to show that they're still healthy, etc. There was a lot of that, and that was during the monarchy period. And eventually, there were lots of one particular society that worked very hard and found very similar problems to those that were being pointed out today.
Thank you.
And I'm just wondering whether we could actually make use of those points
Historical
as well.
examples.
It's, there quite be valuable things to go into those societies, and there was a lot of publications on the question.
Definitely. Thank you very much. And final question, if it can be brief, please.
Hi, my name is Dana Ramadan. I'm from Lebanon. My question is on the role of social networking platforms in enabling these hate crimes, including violence against women, because a lot of hate speech happens on these platforms, which then translate to real-life physical violence. And I saw that Facebook was very briefly mentioned in this documentary. So I wanted to ask, to what extent do you think these platforms, including Facebook, WhatsApp, and other social networking platforms, play an enabling role in human trafficking, in this case, in Iraq? And at the same time, because these tools are double-edged swords, they can also be used for to be on the side of the victims as well. So can these victims also use these platforms to maybe blow the whistle or report on these issues that they're experiencing? So this is my second question.
Thank you for that question. Okay, you all have 1 minute each to answer all those questions. Beginning with Rothna.
So I'm not sure of the national network, so I don't know, maybe you can answer that one.
You were going to answer that.
But okay, just to say, with trafficking, sex trafficking, there's often networks of sex trafficking, and it's one of the most dangerous pieces of investigation to do. So huge congrats to Simona for doing this, but I can tell you, people don't think of women's rights as being particularly sensitive, but it's very sensitive, particularly sex trafficking. When you're going into these areas, it's very, very powerful actors. They're completely intimately linked with the state, with the police and so on. The documentary is clear on that, but it's incredibly difficult to actually infiltrate and know exactly who's doing what. In terms of the historical background, I do want to make a distinction between sex work and forced prostitution. You know, sex work has existed for the beginning of time, and this does exist for women who willingly engage in this. But what we're against is those who are forced into prostitution. And any child engaged in this is forced prostitution. The anti-trafficking law of Iraq doesn't say it like that. You have to prove that you were coerced as a child into prostitution, which is not what international law requires. It requires you to say any child in sexual exploitation is a form of trafficking. So just wanted to clarify that a little bit. But I'll hand over to you now.
Yeah, maybe Janat, and then final word to Simona. But Janat, 1 minute to solve all of these problems.
شبكات التواصل الاجتماعي بالنسبة
social platforms, social network platforms can be a disaster. On Instagram, on Facebook, on daily basis, we see minors, girls, with their pictures and their phone numbers, their contact information for people who would like to reach out to them. So this is a huge problem. There are specialized networks in order to lure girls and drag them into these networks. I think it's important for Facebook, for Twitter, for Instagram. It's vitally important to stop and crack down on these trafficking networks. This is quite an important point for us. Of course, social media platforms sometimes enable us and help us to identify the victims, but anyone who can go out to Instagram and make a simple search for certain names for prostitution houses, he can simply find them over the social media and reach out to them.
And Simona?
So in terms of international networks, I didn't come across any evidence that there were international actors involved, and that maybe just doesn't mean that it's not there. It's just I didn't come across it because, as Rofna said, it's extremely difficult to pin down who is doing what. From what I found was that it appeared that there were a lot of different actors. It was very decentralized, different government institutions involved in it, different armed groups, but I didn't really come across any evidence that there is some kind of external link. But I did very much focus on Iraqi girls because I wanted to highlight the link between some of the social and economical issues that then push women into forced prostitution. So my focus was on Iraqi girls and women. Perhaps had I focused more on foreign workers and foreign women, I would have come across that link. With regard to social media, they play a huge role, and they're being exploited by the traffickers to a large extent. Not only as Janat mentioned that there's public advertisement of women and girls. One thing that didn't make it into the documentary, there's a lot of traffickers will use Facebook and social media to, for example, lure girls to run away from home by proposing marriage. So it may not seem like it's something, that it may not look like it's it's prostitution, or it's not something that is very obvious, but just a guy will reach out on Facebook, I love you, I want to marry you, come run away with me, and that's just the first step. In terms of policing that, I think it's a global issue that doesn't just affect Iraq. I think again the solution is awareness and education. So to really educate these girls of how to approach social media. And I think the one thing that was mentioned in the documentary was that the fact that many of these girls and women from poor backgrounds grow up very sheltered, they just don't have the exposure to evaluate and to deal with strange men who approach them on social media and to know how to respond. So, again, it goes back to some of these very conservative social norms that are very much the root cause. And here, this is the irony, and that's something that really we try to bring out in this documentary, that, you have the tribes and the clerics who always say, like, oh, we want to protect the women, and that's why they should not do this, they should not do that, they should not go out of the house. But it's the exact opposite. It leaves women isolated, ignorant, uneducated, and that's exactly what makes them vulnerable to trafficking.
Thank you. Thank you very much to Simona, Rofna, and Janat for all of your work for this film, and for really, I've learned a lot from this, and it's great that we've had so many questions. It's very rare to have people want to keep going and going, and the audience has remained. And hopefully we can continue the conversation upstairs. Thank you also for the Iraq Initiative for allowing us to do these things, UCL, Crescent Petroleum, and the Swedish for their support, and to our team, Georgia, Haida, Rani at Chatham House. And hopefully this is just the continuation of continued conversations. Thank you to you all as well for joining. See you upstairs.